You might say, if you're a theist, that such acts are prohibited by God, and if there's no God, well, obviously they're permitted. Well, certainly it's true that if you're an atheist, you can't say they're prohibited by God.
Purge Christianity, shut down the churches, kill all the priests, establish the new man and the new utopia, liberated from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality.
Neither is a valid argument. So I want to focus on the particular question that we are discussing without getting distracted by issues about whether views that I hold are or not right. If Faith in Action or Christian Union want to come back and organise a debate some other time specifically about my views, I'll be happy to do that. That's not what we're doing tonight. What we are doing tonight is to discuss the issue that is often summed up in the contention famously put forward by Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Karamazov Brothers, where he said, actually he didn't exactly say this, it isn't a quote, but it is a reasonable summary: if there is no God, everything is permitted. So I want to say, well, should we believe that? Why should we believe that? Why would anyone think, for example, consider any of the atrocities that we have sadly had to witness in this century, young as it still is? Think about 9/11, think about Darfur, or about the Congo, what's been happening there, or more recently, just very recently, fresh in our memories, what happened in Mumbai. And ask yourself, well, if there were no God, would all that be permitted? One question that might occur to you then is, well, what do you mean, permitted by whom? So, obviously, these actions, these atrocities, are not permitted by law in any nation, as far as I'm aware, these sorts of things. And even now internationally, we have a developing body of international law. We have an international criminal court which exists to make sure that even where these things, these crimes are not prosecuted in the country in which they're committed, that they are against international law and that people can be tried in the International Criminal Court, despite the best efforts of the professedly Christian administration of this country over the last 8 years to undermine the status of the International Criminal Court and to refuse to be part of it. So these things are not permitted by law, but of course we're not really talking about law, we're talking about morality. You might say, if you're a theist, that such acts are prohibited by God, and if there's no God, well, obviously they're permitted. Well, certainly it's true that if you're an atheist, you can't say they're prohibited by God. But first, the fact that theists can say that some acts are prohibited by God doesn't make it true that they are. And if there is no God, then it's obviously also not true that they're prohibited by God. That statement is false. So I'm just going to take 1 minute of my time, perhaps, to say why I think they can't be prohibited by God, because there isn't a God in the sense of a God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There are other gods about which perhaps I might have other doubts, but the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is supposed to be a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. And if you look at the world around us, indeed, if you look at some of the very events that I've been describing, I don't think there could be such a God in this world, because such a God would not permit these events to take place. Now, if you might say, well, these events that I've described occur through human free will, and for some reason that's a greater good than the evils that humans commit, that still doesn't resolve the problem, because there's also immense suffering that occurs without any intervention of human free will. For example, people die not only because they're killed by other humans, but they die in droughts, and they die in floods, and they die in earthquakes. And often these people are innocent of any conceivable sin because perhaps they're a year old, and and they die slow, lingering deaths. And it's hard to see how that can be justified or defended by free will. And even if, although I think this is a repellent doctrine, you were to say they suffer because they too have original sin, since they are descended from Adam and Eve, as indeed some Christians would say, we still have the insoluble problem of the suffering of non-human animals who are not descended from Adam and Eve, do not take part in original sin, and yet suffer slow, lingering deaths in droughts and famines and earthquakes, just as humans do. So I think there is no reconciliation of the existence of that kind of suffering and the kind of God of the Christian and Jewish traditions. So I think that it's not a good argument to say that these things are not permitted because God prohibits them, because you would need to defend the idea that such a God exists. So I think that the question, can there be morality without God, really comes to a question of, can there be morality, given that we are in a universe without God? But of course, we can suspend our disbelief in God and ask questions about what difference would it make to morality if there were a God. So let's again then ask, why would one think that these acts that I mentioned, that I'm sure we all think and I think are morally wrong, would not be morally wrong if there were a God?
Peter Singer focuses on the central issue: whether morality depends on God. History shows that moral order existed long before organized religion. The Code of Hammurabi, Confucian ethics, and Greek philosophy all outlined justice, fairness, and restraint without divine command. Humanity has always built systems of right and wrong through cooperation and empathy, not revelation. Singer turns to the evidence around us. Infants die in floods. Animals starve in droughts. Entire regions suffer through famine and disease. These events are not the result of human will or moral failure. They are the outcomes of a natural world indifferent to suffering. Invoking original sin cannot explain why an infant or a fawn must endure pain. For centuries, philosophers such as Epicurus and David Hume have noted the same contradiction. A being described as all-powerful and all-good could not preside over a universe filled with innocent suffering. The problem lies not in human morality, but in the premise itself. Morality arises from human reason and compassion. It is created, tested, and refined by experience, not by divine command, but by human conscience.
In other words, why take the chance? But if I keep going, if I listen, you may say, to my Darwinian instinct, I feel this powerful sense of qualms and anxiety and frustration. There is, in a sense, the unavoidable sense that I'm doing something wrong. It is almost as if it's not just a feeling, it's not just a reason, it is almost as if, you may say, there is a transcendental voice that is speaking within me that has no power to coerce me, but has every power, in a sense, to establish an ineradicable standard that even I, try as I may, cannot resist paying attention to. My question is, where does this transcendental, powerful sense that is within us, where does that come from? What is its Darwinian foundation? The bottom line is, I'm saying that whether or not we disagree on the margin about this morality or that morality, we all know that as human beings we are moral creatures. And by moral creatures, what I mean is we have moral standards. Standards that we did not create. Now, we may not live up to those standards. Peter Singer's right about that. But that proves absolutely nothing. It simply means the standards are better than us. Quite frankly, if we devised them, most likely we would not devise standards that we could not live up to. The fact is, we embrace standards, you may say, that set a bar that none of us can fully jump over or scale. Now, in some senses, this idea that we are Darwinian primates can generate an attempt to create, you might say, secular morality. One reason I'm interested in Professor Singer's work is he says very clearly, he says, many of the things that we take for granted, for example, take the idea that human life is sacred. He says that is not, if you will, morality. That's Christian morality. He says man is on a Darwinian continuum with the beasts. We're not special. We're no different. He goes, but what Christianity has done, and what man has done more generally, is take Homo sapiens and put him on this pedestal and assign to him special protections and special rights, which are you may say, while demeaning the rest of creation. Sort of the biblical idea that the rest of creation is now man's to use for his instrumental purposes. And what Singer says is that once we realize that God is dead, we've got to reverse all this. We cannot do what the new atheists want to do. The new atheists want to kill God, but keep Christian values of liberty, equality, compassion, and so on. And Singer can't do it. If you want to kill God, there goes human dignity. There goes the idea of the specialness of human beings. There goes the idea of human rights. Why he's working at an institute for human values, I have no idea. But nevertheless, now, the point I want to make is this. If we want to look at what secular morality really is, if we want to see if Dostoevsky is right, if God is not, everything is permitted, we cannot look to Belgium or France. We have to look really to the communist regimes of the 20th century, efforts to really, you might say, purge Christianity, shut down the churches, kill all the priests, establish the new man and the new utopia, liberated from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality. And when you look at the body count of those atheist regimes, by the way, a body count that would make a bin Laden blush, even a junior league atheist like Pol Pot in Indochina managed to kill about 2 million people in the short space of 3 years. So atheism, you might say, not religion, is responsible for the mass murders of history. Peter Singer, when he advocates infanticide, when he advocates euthanasia, and when in the same breath he advocates animal rights, he puzzles some people, but he is really, in a sense, thinking through the implications of atheism. He's saying if you remove God, man comes down from the pedestal and the natural continuum with the animals is restored. I know that because Singer has advocated the killing of infants and so on, the killing of the handicapped, some people have said he's a Nazi. And he has protested this and said, this is ridiculous, I'm not a Nazi. And I think in a way he's right. Because the Nazis advocated, you might say, state-sponsored genocide. What Peter Singer advocates is actually something very different. Private sector homicide. In other words, don't make the government do it, you do it. Now, I cite Singer's work not to prove atheism or God, but to show you that secularism, when you really remove the religious presuppositions, is a little bit of a frightening idea. We might be moving in that direction, but if we do, the next time you have someone over for dinner, just make sure to count your spoons. Thank you very much.
At this point, we're going to collect note cards and solicit questions that I hope you've been writing. If you're on the ground floor, please pass your note cards to the center aisle where they'll be collected. If you're in the balcony, please just pass your note cards to the back. And we'll take 1 or 2 minutes now to collect the note cards. We move on now to the rebuttals, starting with Peter Singer, who will have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, we are Darwinian primates. We are, that is, primates who have evolved from other primates. I think that's established scientifically. Dinesh doesn't deny it, as I understand his position. Do we have to believe that there is some transcendental spark that is contrary to the evolutionary account in order to explain why we have morality and why we behave as we do, and why occasionally heroic people jump in and save heavy, drowning strangers, although also very often they don't? I don't think we do need any such account. I think we can explain the existence of compassion, concern for others, in the way we have evolved as mammals, as beings who've had to take care of their own children, as beings who've lived in small communities where we're often related to other members of the community and want to save them and support them, and that helps the survival of our genes as well. And of course, as social beings who live in communities that reciprocate, as indeed our close primate relatives do as well. We're not unique in this. And form reciprocal bonds. And there's a lot of research that suggests that the best strategy in these conditions is, at least initially, to help strangers. And only if it turns out that they are not going to help you do you then cease to help them or even pay them back for the bad deeds that they do you. The simple ethic known as tit for tat works quite well in game theory that models evolution. So it's possible to explain why we do some of the rescues we do in those ways. Some people perhaps have this to a stronger degree than others and therefore are more likely to do the rescues. What's completely compatible with the Darwinian account and is not explained by the idea of a transcendental light turning on that we need to save strangers because of our belief in the sanctity of human life, is precisely what I talked about before when I talked about our failure to follow the teachings of Jesus as reported in the Gospels about the rich people giving to the poor. We don't do that. We have 1 billion people living in extreme poverty in the world today, living on $1 or so a day. We have 27,000 children under 5 who died today, according to UNICEF, from avoidable poverty-related causes. That's 10 million a year, and we don't help them. Well, the Darwinian can explain why we don't help them. We've evolved these responses, this compassion, in a face-to-face society. And if we see a child there, a starving child right there, we will help. We'll take the bread off our table and give it to them, because that's how we've evolved. But if we learn through the papers that there are children in need of assistance, maybe not starving, maybe just needing better health care or safe water elsewhere in the world, most of us don't help. Christian or non-Christian, most of us don't help. And that's unfortunate, I think. I think it's contrary to the morality we should hold, but it's quite in accordance with what you would expect from a Darwinian account. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not possible for us to do more and help, and to act more morally than you might expect.
Peter Singer opens from a Darwinian premise. Humans are social primates whose moral sense emerges from evolution, not divine decree. Empathy, fairness, and cooperation are not gifts from heaven. They are products of natural selection. Frans de Waal's studies of chimpanzees show complex behaviors that mirror our ethics. Reconciliation after conflict, collective punishment of cheaters, even compassion toward the weak. Game theory experiments reveal why strategies rooted in reciprocity outperform pure self-interest. Neuroscience strengthens this picture. Moral judgment activates areas of the brain tied to empathy and future planning, not divine revelation. Conscience, in this light, is not a supernatural implant but an evolved instinct, a social mechanism that bound early communities together. Singer grounds his view in human reality. If morality truly came from a higher power, the world's suffering would look different. Every day, more than 25,000 children die from preventable poverty-related causes. Famine, exploitation, and inequality persist not because people lack faith, but because empathy evolved for small, visible circles, families, tribes, neighbors, not vast abstract populations. Understanding that limitation offers power. It means morality is flexible. We can expand it through reason, education, and collective design. Institutions, not commandments, can stretch compassion beyond the tribal level, just as democracy and human rights evolved through human effort, not divine intervention. Dinesh D'Souza responds from another angle. He speaks of an inner voice, a moral intuition that feels absolute, binding even when inconvenient. For him, that voice cannot be reduced to neurons or natural instincts. It points to a transcendental source, something outside of evolution, commanding allegiance regardless of consequence. He warns that when societies reject that foundation, they risk moral collapse. He points to the atheist regimes of the 20th century, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, as examples of what happens when belief in a higher order disappears. In his view, the sanctity of life, human rights, and moral dignity all depend on something greater than humanity itself. The tension between Singer and D'Souza is philosophical but deeply practical. Singer insists that morality, like language, is an adaptive tool, something humanity built and can improve. D'Souza insists that without transcendence, moral laws lose authority. Yet history shows both sides shaping our current world. Secular reason gave rise to modern ethics, abolition, democracy, human rights, while religious traditions preserved shared symbols of moral duty and restraint. Both perspectives converge on one challenge. Survival depends on expanding empathy faster than our capacity for destruction. Whether that expansion is guided by reason or faith, the task remains the same: to build systems that protect life, dignity, and fairness. The question is not whose morality is purer, but which vision helps us act before indifference wins. Because in the end, the survival of morality may not depend on belief in God, but on how far humanity can extend its own.
The point I'm getting at here is, it is irrational to dismiss religion in so cavalier a way. At the very least, if most people are irrational, you've now got to give an account for why Peter Singer's eminently rational project can work with irrational human beings. Now, with regard to non-theistic morality, here's the point I'm getting at, and that is, I'm accusing in a way the atheist of profound ingratitude. I'm saying to the atheist what the greatest living philosopher, arguably, and an atheist, Jürgen Habermas said, that is that the core principles of our civilization, liberty, equality, human dignity, and the idea of justice, he says, are rooted in the Hebrew tradition of the prophets and the Christian tradition of Christ. Now, what he's saying is, even secular people ought to recognize this. It doesn't take a great deal of historical investigation to see that our civilization is built on Athens and Jerusalem. That is an historical fact. Our institutions and values come out of that. So the atheist is standing on a religious mountain that he or she ungratefully refuses to acknowledge. He's pretending, or she's pretending, I'm developing a purely secular ethic, although buried in that secular ethic are assumptions of compassion, of concern, of universal human brotherhood, of equality that have all been smuggled in and imported from Christianity.
For Peter Singer, if there is no creator to decide what is right, how are your views any more legitimate than anyone else's? Aren't yours just a set of preferences? What foundations do you ground human values on?
How are my views more legitimate than anyone else's? In one sense, the answer to that is simply they're not. That is, they have no authority. I'm not asking you to believe what I say because I'm a professor at Princeton or anything of the sort. On the other hand, I'm asking you to listen to what I'm saying and to the reasons why I'm saying it. And if my views are more legitimate than someone else's, it's because you think I've given better reasons for what I've said than that someone else, whoever that might be, would be. So that's your decision. That's up to you and others who discuss the issue to see how the arguments come out. And that's what legitimacy in this area of philosophy consists in.
I'm going to go with the individual questions and then we'll end with the questions for both. I think we'll have time to get to all of them if our speakers continue in their short, pithy ways. Dinesh D'Souza, if the inner sense that you describe is the clue that God exists and therefore the guide to us to find morality, does what our inner sense say supersede the dictates of God? Could there be a conflict between these two moral guides, the inner sense and God?
Two things about that. First of all, I think that that is a restatement of the conundrum raised by Plato that Peter Singer alluded to. First of all, let me say that I think that the reason I identify this inner sense as transcendental is that morality in general can be almost defined as that which militates against self-interest. If Darwinism can be understood as self-interest writ large, then morality can be understood as that which tells you to act against doing something that you otherwise would want to do. I want to steal. I want to have sex with every beautiful woman in the world. I want to spread my genes. Now true, there is a sense in which as a Machiavellian I might say I want to make sure I don't get caught. But short of that, that's my Darwinian goal. The voice that tells me not to do this is thwarting me at every stage. Every time I try to do something for my own benefit, it whispers no. So it is the fact that this inner sense operates against Darwinian self-interest that is a clue to its nature. Second point is the question of is it from God or is it not from God, and is justice identical with God? I think we're making here what philosophers sometimes call a category mistake, and I'll explain what I mean by reference to Plato himself. Plato's talking about justice, and he says, rather surprisingly, that the highest form of justice is discretion. Now, for us, that's surprising because we always learn that the best form of justice is law. But Plato says no. If you have, you might say, full information, if you are a philosopher king, if you are a god, then you will apply justice tailored to the individual situation. For example, if I have 3 children, I don't make laws. I look at their individual needs and I pattern my treatment of each one according to their own talents and needs. It is only in liberal society when you descend from the God's eye point of view to the human point of view, where we distrust human authority, that we say, look, we don't want to have discretion, we would rather live with law. In other words, when I'm speeding on the highway, I don't want to say, I'll let the cop kind of decide if I'm going too fast. There are some people who go safely at 70, there are other people who drive unsafely at 30. We're just going to let discretion be the order of the day. No, because we don't trust the cop. So we say, we'll all drive at 65 miles an hour or less, because liberalism is for human beings. Another way to put it is law is for fallible human beings. Law does not apply to God, because God is in that Platonic position of discretion. So the problem raised by Plato is a legitimate one as applied to all human beings. It is a meaningless one as applied to God.
Peter Singer, how do you explain humanity's ability to appreciate beauty, this hall, to love, to cry? Animals, non-human animals, do not have this.
Oh, I think that's clearly false in terms of love, for example. Obviously, beings with more sophisticated abilities can love in different ways, but it seems quite evident if you observe behavior of non-human animals, particularly, I'm thinking about mammals here, that there is love. One of the things that I object to about farming, for example, is that to produce the milk you drink, you have to repeatedly make cows pregnant and remove their calves so that you can get the milk. And clearly, every farmer who does that will tell you that the cow misses her calf and vice versa, that she looks around where the calf was. I've read anecdotes from farmers that months after the calf was taken from the cow, every time the cow passed that point, she looked around and bellowed for the calf. There is certainly mother-child love in animals. There is, I would say, there's clearly sexual love, sexual bonding in animals. The human phenomenon is more complicated. It involves higher mental capacities, no doubt about it, but it is fundamentally the same capacity. And I think, these other capacities that you asked about also have those kinds of accounts. Now, even in terms of beauty, there's an account in a book that I co-edited called The Great Ape Project by an observer of chimpanzees in Africa, how a chimpanzee would climb the ridge just before sunset and settle down on the ridge to watch the sun setting over Lake Tanganyika, clearly appreciating the spectacle, as indeed the human observer was. this goes right back to Darwin's little book on the expression of the emotions in man and animals. What we have is continuous with the emotions that animals feel.
Mr. D'Souza, why do you seem to consider only the Christian God moral? What about other monotheistic faiths? And I might sneak in one because there's more for you. What do you think about Kant's argument that humans can have an understanding of goodness, perfection, and therefore a moral sense independent of God?
Well, first of all, that is not exactly Kant's position. Kant's position is that this morality derived from reason is nevertheless postulated on an assumption of God. But on other religions, I think that, look, all religions in the world are based on some idea of cosmic justice. Right away, you see a problem with purely secular morality. The problem with secular morality is that we live in a world where many times bad people prosper and good people come to grief. So any instruction we give people to be good must be sorely qualified by the recognition that many times it is the terrible guy who ends up on top, many times it's the good guy who comes to grief. Now, all the great religions of the world, in a sense, are based on the idea that while that may be the story of life, it's not the full story. That there's ultimately, you may say, cosmic accountability. So if you consider Hinduism, the idea may be that you're a perfect jerk in this life, so we're going to be seeing you as a cockroach in the next life. Cosmic justice. While the different religions of the world might differ in theology, they very often agree on morality. The theologian Hans Kung a couple of years ago assembled what he called the World Parliament of Religions. The Buddhists, the Taoists, the Muslims, the Hindus, all in the same room. And they sat down to say, what common things can we agree upon? And they drew up a charter.
Peter Singer makes a clear and grounded argument. Morality doesn't descend from faith. It emerges from human empathy, reason, and shared experience. We don't need divine command to recognize fairness or suffering. Evolutionary science shows that compassion existed long before religion. Primates reconcile after conflict. Elephants mourn their dead. Even rats refuse food if it harms another. These behaviors reveal that the moral instinct is older than any scripture, biological, not theological, rooted in survival through cooperation and care. Singer builds from that foundation. The moral values we uphold, equality, rights, justice, grew through reflection and struggle, not revelation. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Paine, and Wollstonecraft expanded these ideas through reason and universal compassion. When slavery ended, when women gained rights, when cruelty to animals became unacceptable. These were victories of conscience guided by logic and empathy, not divine decree. Progress was driven by questioning authority, not obeying it. Dinesh D'Souza argues that morality implies God, that without a higher source, ethics lose meaning. But Singer points to evidence. Secular nations often rank higher in trust, generosity, and social welfare. Scandinavian countries, for instance, combine low religiosity with strong moral frameworks and civic responsibility. Morality thrives where people hold one another accountable, not where belief dictates behavior. Singer's view is straightforward but powerful. Ethics evolve through reasoned dialogue and emotional intelligence. Humanity built morality not as a command from above, but as a reflection of who we are. Thinking, feeling beings capable of empathy and justice. The real test of morality isn't whether it comes from God, but whether it grows with us, guided by compassion, knowledge, and the courage to do what's right without being told. What's your take on this? Do moral values depend on religion, or can empathy and reason stand on their own? It's a question that shaped centuries of debate. Share your thoughts below. And if this sparked new ideas, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep the discussion going.